and welcome once again to our series on the life of Christ by the Venerable Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen. If you are following in the text, we are in chapter 14, page 174 and 5. If you need to purchase a text, you may do so on CatholicBook.net or stop here at St. Raphael Center on Fulton Avenue and obtain a copy for yourself. The next section is entitled The Bread of Life. 2 banquets were held in Galilee in the course of a year, one in the court of Herod, at which John the Baptist preached, the other a banquet in an open air served by our Lord. He had crossed over the Sea of Galilee, probably to avoid the fury of Herod, who had just murdered the Baptist. And as we read in John chapter 6, verse 2, there was a great multitude following him. They had seen the miracles he performed over the sick. Their motives for following him were somewhat confused, but there was a growing idea that he was the Christ. Greatly disappointed were they when he retired to the mountains with his disciples. The gospel chariot was stopped briefly for the sake of a little rest for those who drove it, because the Passover was near, and many were on their way to Jerusalem. The crowd swelled to 5,000, not counting women and children. Mark 6:31 gives us an accounting of this. There were many coming and going, and they scarcely had leisure even to eat. The little town to which they came was 6 miles across the water from Capernaum. When our Lord got out of the boat, as he touched shore, the multitudes were there to meet him. They had brought their sick with him. They were hungry in more ways than one. They gave him no repose, not because they believed him to be the Son of God, but because they regarded him as a magician who could do wonders, or a physician who could heal the sick. Mark 6:34 describes this, and he had pity on them, since they were like sheep, they have no shepherd. He arranged the crowds in rows of 150, each row seated a little higher than the one below. In the center of them all stood our Lord, testing Philip. He asked, in John 6:5, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" Philip made a rapid calculation that it would take 200 pennies worth to feed the multitude. Jesus did not ask how much money is needed, but whence would come the bread. Philip should have answered that he who had raised the dead and healed the sick could supply the bread. Andrew then pointed to a boy who had 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Andrew too did a little arithmetic and asked, "But what is that among so many?" in John 6, verse 9. In the Old Testament, God was pleased to use trivial and insignificant things to fulfill his purpose, like the flag on a cradle of a baby, which won the heart of Pharaoh's daughter, or the shepherd's stick of Moses, which worked miracles in Egypt, or the slingshot of David, which overthrew the Philistines. Because bread was now involved, there was even a kind of a parallel to the gestures that were used at the Last Supper. Mark 6:41. And he took the 5 loaves and 2 fish and looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, gave these to his disciples. Now, there is here a great parallel between the Old Testament and the New. As Sheen points out here, when we look at the Old Testament with Moses, there are similarities here with Jesus. The shepherd's staff Jesus is the Good Shepherd. The feeding of the people. In the Old Testament, God feeds the people, the children of Israel, with the manna, the bread from heaven. Jesus, in the New Testament, is the bread that comes down from heaven. So when he feeds this multitude, and he takes the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and there's a multiplication of the fish and the loaves, it is a prefiguration of what he's going to tell the apostles. You will be fishers of men, to feed souls. I am the bread of life. In the Old Testament, when Moses goes to Sinai and he lays the staff on the ground before the burning bush, God makes that staff a powerful weapon against the enemies of Israel. He empowers Moses with prayer. He even changes his appearance. And when he comes from the mountain, his wife Sephora says to Joshua, look, he has changed. His hair was white, and his beard was white. And Moses now became the living testament for the children of Israel, just as Jesus would become the New Testament and the bread of life for the children of God. So this parallels, and as the grain of wheat slowly multiplies in the ground, so the bread and the fish, by divinely hastened process, were multiplied until everyone had their fill. It's the same with the Eucharist. Jesus fills us with the Eucharistic bread of life. That Eucharist is multiplied and is present for us in the tabernacle, the Blessed Sacrament. So Christ is there for us as that grain of wheat that has been multiplied. The effect of the miracle on that multitude was stupendous. There was no denying the fact that Christ had divine power. He showed it in multiplying the bread. It brought to their minds back immediately to Moses, who had given their forefathers manna in the desert. So they understood this now, because they knew their forefathers had been given the manna. And had not Moses said that he was the prefigure of Christ or Messiah? Deuteronomy 18:15 points out, "Know the Lord thy God will raise up for thee a prophet like myself, of thy own race, a brother of thy own. It is to him thou must listen." So we don't know the effects when Moses went before the burning bush, what he saw or heard, other than the voice of God. When he was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights, God conversed with him. We don't know if there was a revelation about Messiah. We don't know what inflamed Moses in the richness of God when he came from Sinai with the commandments in his arms and embraced the will of God as Jesus did when he went to the temple. Moses called the people to one of two things: either prayer and come to God, or die by God. And he flung the tablets against the golden calf. Those that were there by that calf died. The ground opened up, and Gehenna swallowed them. When Jesus goes to the temple, my house is a house of prayer, not a den of thieves. He drives out the money changers. Those that came to prayer went in for prayer. Those that were driven out were out. So we see the parallel here that Bishop Sheen is making. The relationship of the two, Moses and the Christ. The flame of Moses in the commandments and the flame of the Moses had anticipated or sealed himself by bread in the desert. Was not this the one to whom Moses had pointed, since he too gave bread miraculously? Who then could be a better king for them to throw off the yoke of the Romans and make them free? Here was a deliverer greater than Joshua. Here was the 5,000 men ready to take up arms. Here was a king greater than David or Solomon, who could rebel against the tyrants and set people free. They had already acknowledged him as prophet and teacher. Now they would proclaim him as king. But the reader of hearts knew how worldly were their ambitions for him. John 6:15. Knowing then that they meant to come and carry him off so as to make him king, Jesus once again withdrew on the hillside all alone. They could not make him king. He was born a king. The wise men knew this as they asked in Matthew 2:2, where is he that has been born, the King of the Jews? We have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. His kingship would come through the divine must of the cross, and not through popular force. Thus was the second time that he declined a crown. The first was Satan, when he offered him the kingship of the world, if he would fall down and adore him. My kingdom is not of this world. He would tell Pilate later on, but the crowd would push him to a throne. He said he would not be pushed. He would rather be lifted up to it, and the throne would be the cross, and his kingship would be over hearts. Now, that is why the parallel between the multiplication of the loaves and the fish and the Mass. In the Greek, the Greeks used the symbol for the apostles and Peter, the ichthos, the fish. You'll see it on bumper stickers on their car. You go into a Byzantine church, sometimes you'll see it above the doorway. The fish with the word ichthos, the big fisherman. So this means, as Christ fed the multitude through Peter, the word and sacrament, so too the bread of life, as you enter this door, will feed you. Because we are the multitude to be fed. That's the meaning here And the glory of the cross, as Christ is saying, would not be the throne of a king, but he himself would be lifted up on the cross as king. The cross would be the throne. That's why in Catholic churches there's the crucifix behind the altar and on the altar, to remind us as we enter that we are coming to the bread of life, and that Christ, the immortal King of glory, is there. Word and sacrament, the glory of the cross, the salvation of the human race, as our Lord himself signified and has given. The crowd responds when Jesus is brought before them. We have no king but Caesar. Our Lord, knowing what was in the hearts of the populace, later would withdraw himself. That's why he went to the mountain alone. No unclean hands would put a crown on his head, except a crown of thorns. But in order to teach his apostles that they too were not to cash in on cheap popularity, he constrained them to take a ship and go to the other side of the lake, a distance of 5 or 6 miles. He did not go with them, because they had to make that journey alone. For themselves, the meaning of sacrifice, loneliness, abandonment, and what it means that Christ will suffer later for themselves. Each one of them, with the exception of St. John, will suffer a hideous death. John is spared because of 2 things. First, he was the beloved disciple and laid his head against the chest of Jesus, the only one to caress his sacred heart. Second, at the cross, he stayed with Mary the entire journey of the Via Dolorosa, even to the tomb. He did not leave her alone. Jesus entrusts all bishops to his mother Mary and priests. This signification here is what is said here on page 178, the bottom paragraph. The hours of 3 and 6 in the morning, as they were shivering wet and weary in the boat, a storm arose. This was the second storm which found them on the lake, after having been called to be apostles. The first was on the occasion of an earlier visit of our Lord. Both storms came at night. Both were violent. It must have been a particularly strong tempest to have affected these men whose lives had been spent on that particular sea. Notice the wording here and who they are. A storm. Apostles. Violent. What's happening in the church today. A storm against apostles, and it's violent. Same thing. It must have been a particularly strong tempest to have affected these men whose lives had been spent on that particular sea. Affected the lives. Now, we see what Jesus is saying about church. It will affect the lives of the apostles, which it is doing day in and day out. There's a bishop now in Washington, not even there a month, who's now on the rocky boat. And lives of the priests of the archdiocese are affected again. And the people. It is very likely that they also doubted the power of the one who had multiplied the bread and then sent them across the lake the night of the storm. If he could multiply bread, why could he not prevent storms? This is the test to see who would be loyal to him and who would not. Later, we know the one who is not. Today, we see those who are not. This is what Jesus is laying out now before us. Okay, we'll take our break. There's coffee back there. There's some cookies and other items there. Help yourself. And then when we return, we'll come back and look at the effects of the storm and the apostles.